E nā mana, e nā reo, e reo rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name's Todd Kriebel. I'm the Chair of Medicines New Zealand. I have the honour this evening of introducing Minister Verrill. But first I want to thank her for sharing this amazing venue with us. This executive wing, the building we generally know as the Beehive, and also want to acknowledge the members of Parliament that are here today, and particularly just to make that point about this being the executive wing, and the chamber across the way is the Parliamentary chamber, where there have been some amazing things happening today, and I'm sure the Minister will say a few things about that. This evening is an opportunity for us to celebrate the progress that we've made in the health sector and to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Last year we talked a bit about the why around genomics, and this year the focus is a bit more on the how we take things forward. The Honourable Dr. Aisha Verrill, as Minister of Health and Minister of Research, Science and Innovation, brings a wealth of experience as an infectious disease doctor, experienced in DHB governance and international research. I feel really fortunate that we have her around the cabinet table with her colleagues, given that she does have both the health and those science portfolios, and in a time when we're really reflecting on that this post-COVID period that we're in, and all of the major changes that are ahead of us with the reorganisation of our health services. So I invite Dr. Aisha Verrill to the podium. Thank you.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā iwi, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka huri ki nā mana whenua o te rohi nei, tēnā koutou. He mihi hoki ki a tātou kua tai mai nei I raro I te kaupapa o te rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, it is a pleasure to join you this evening for the Medicines New Zealand annual dinner. And thank you, Todd, for your very warm introduction. It's appropriate that, as you've outlined, tonight's theme is on the how of genomics and precision medicine, because I feel with the health reforms well underway, and 1 year since the stand-up of our two new entities, Te Whatuora and Te Aka Whaiora, we are ready as a health system to talk more about the how of implementing innovation in our health system. And I want to focus my remarks on that this evening. I also want to acknowledge the role that many of you play in supporting medical innovation. It is an absolutely crucial function in terms of our health system, and of course the thing that matters, keeping our people well. But let's start with the health reforms. Through the Paiora legislation, we are transforming our health system for all New Zealanders, and it really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the way we deliver health care. The government has a vision for a health system that is more equitable, accessible, integrated and sustainable. A system that puts people at its centre and delivers better outcomes for all New Zealanders. The health reforms have provided an enormous opportunity for Te Whatuora to work with Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, to accelerate whānau-centred improvement and innovation projects to improve access, equity and population health outcomes. We as a system need innovation, and we need it to be focused right now on some of the areas of highest priority. We need to see rapid development of new models of care, enabled by data and technology, including medicines, to deliver care in the home and the community. We need to do this as we uphold Te Tiratia Waitangi principles and ensure that innovation reduces health inequities for Māori and other priority populations. Significant innovation is happening outside our health system as a consequence of technological advances, for example, artificial intelligence and biotechnology, along with major investment in medicines and new technologies, health technologies. So we need to tap into this and learn from the best nationally and internationally. That's why Te Whatuora is working with Te Aka Whaiora to create an agreed process to consider and evaluate new innovative ideas This work is being developed over the next 6 months and will provide clear guidance on priority areas and populations for investment. Alongside this work, Te Whatuora will develop design labs, platforms and data standards to bring together diverse groups, including researchers, care practitioners, policymakers, consumers and industry, to co-design new and innovative approaches to accelerate learning. I'm pleased that Te Whatuora has in its executive leadership team, or Tier 2, Dale Bramley working as the Director of System Improvement and Innovation. It's the first time our system has had that perspective on innovation at such a senior level. The health reforms have also created opportunities for the Ministry of Health, Manatū Hauora, to expand its focus on evidence, analytics, health and research, and develop a more strategic leadership role. Manatū Hauora recently sought feedback on its draft long-term insights briefing on precision health, and will shortly publish the final briefing. I know many of you would have contributed to that feedback. Precision health is an umbrella term for the use of technology and information to develop more precise ways of keeping people healthy. So this future-focused briefing explores the opportunities and challenges in precision health through 2 examples that stakeholders were particularly interested in: genomics and artificial intelligence. In the future, increasing use of genomics offers potential for more efficient targeting of medicines, improved cancer detection, use of genome editing techniques leading to targeted therapies, and cures for previously untreatable rare diseases. Artificial intelligence offers new ways to analyse large amounts of data, identify patterns and personalised treatment recommendations. You all know these technologies are developing rapidly and they present new ways to think about treating health issues and disease and using health promotion and prevention tools. However, they also create new risks and challenges that need to be considered and mitigated. To make the most of the opportunities current and emerging technologies offer, we need to think far more proactively about potential changes that might be required to enable Aotearoa New Zealand to foster innovation and ensure the benefits of these technologies are experienced equitably and in line with our Te Tiriti commitments. This includes ensuring we have the necessary systems, processes, investments and regulation in place to mitigate these risks and use tools for everyone's benefit. These changes that we have underway in our system will mean that we will be better able to absorb new innovation. But it is fair to say that the current situation with genomic and other technology in New Zealand has relatively little deployment. We have genomic and other molecular technology available in New Zealand, and we have researchers, some of whom's work is world-leading, but there is limited awareness, and access to these are unevenly distributed, and available testing is limited. There is a lack of national infrastructure supporting integrated infrastructure, genomics data, workforce capability and capacity, and more research, innovation and health tech assessments are needed to embed genomic medicine in New Zealand and enable improved and equitable health outcomes. In addition, the health system needs to partner with Māori from the outset when designing these systems and implementing new technologies to ensure that Māori aspirations and needs are met, including the protection of DNA, whakapapa and data. Another example of key work underway is that led by Manatū Hauora, the Ministry of Health, in collaboration with the other entities to strengthen the environment for clinical trials. And I see Ian Town is here, who has been very involved in this work. It will ensure that New Zealand has an equitable and sustainable national approach to clinical trials, where we can experience the health, social and economic benefits that come from a thriving clinical trials sector. For example, there is currently a research platform facilitating tumour molecular screening with next-generation sequencing for patients with advanced cancers. Clinician researchers have the ambition to grow this platform to include other disease groups and enable access for all New Zealanders. A decentralised clinical trial model is also a novel method to enable access to a study independent of where you live, and work on that is underway too. The partnering of these two innovations will allow patients to participate in molecular screening and trials closer to home. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Therapeutic Products Bill, which was passed today. This legislation will provide New Zealanders with assurances they would expect about the quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines and medical devices, and the quality and safety of natural health products. The Medicines Act has not kept pace with change. That's led to long-standing gaps in the regulation of some therapeutic products, such as medical devices. Not to mention, it doesn't even mention, advanced cell and gene therapies. My first interaction with the Medicines Act was amending it retrospectively and under urgency in order to allow the COVID-19 vaccine to be approved as part of the vaccine rollout. I think I was a brand new minister and MP at the time, and it really illustrated to me just how out of date our Medicines Act is. The Therapeutic Products Bill addresses these challenges and provides more comprehensive and fit-for-purpose regulation for these health technologies. Of course, consumer and patient safety is fundamental, but this doesn't need to be a barrier to encouraging innovation. This bill enables new and bespoke pathways for innovative products that are easily navigated and aligned with international standards. It'll provide a clear pathway for novel therapies to enter the market and to be put to clinical use. Alongside supporting innovative products, the bill also provides opportunities for service innovation by streamlining regulatory barriers in pharmacy, practice, and prescribing authorities. The scope of the bill is wider than innovation, but I have made sure that innovation gets the priority it deserves in the bill. One of the principles I wrote into the bill requires the regulation of therapeutic products be done in a manner that supports innovation. The new regime is expected to come into force in 2026, and work will begin shortly on the secondary legislation, which will flesh out the new regime. There will be plenty of opportunities for input from stakeholders, including all of you in this room, into key elements of the design of the new system. So in closing, I want to recognise the contribution of the pharmaceutical industry to our health system. Your contribution is a vital one. We can all agree that we want to see modern, effective and safe treatments that improve and extend the quality of life for New Zealanders. It's fitting tonight, on the night that we've passed the Therapeutic Products Bill, to just reflect on how far we've come. That bill is 20 years in the making. One of the officials I worked with to pass it had been working on it for 15 years. There are other important milestones that we have recently passed. We just increased the medicines budget in the time since 2017, the budget for Pharmac by 40%, allowing Pharmac to make an extra 241 funding decisions since the 2017-18 financial year, including 76 new listings and widening access to 138 treatments. We know that the subsequent impact on the health and well-being of New Zealanders is considerable. In addition, this government is also committed to strengthening the research and science sector, and you would have heard in Budget 23 a commitment to research hubs in Wellington, including one focused on biotech at Gracefield. I want to thank Steve Mahari for his work in bringing together the different partners that will collaborate at that site as we were scoping our options there. And finally, it's easy to forget when we talk about the large amounts of money in medicines budgets and innovation investments, that sometimes a very small amount of money can make a big difference to people. And that's why I was particularly proud in the budget to be able to wipe the $5 copay on medicines. And thank you, Andrew, for you and the Pharmacy Guild's work in order to be able to make sure that all the products of innovations reach the people who need them. So I want to hope we can all agree that the future for medicines innovation in New Zealand is promising. Thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. I wish you well. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Well, I just want to really re-emphasize this point. It's 20 years. It would have been 20 ministers. It would have been 200 officials. And I can't think of how much money was spent just working through with that bill to finally get it across the line. So, amazing job. Congratulations. I think we need another round of applause. Yeah. At this stage, then, I'd like to invite Simon Morton forward. Simon will be known to many of you, and he emceed last year. And Simon's got a long history in radio journalism, and is currently living down south. He's come back to Wellington. We used to live in the same neighbourhood. The floor is yours.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Todd, and thank you. Piki mai, kake mai, ko Simon Morton aho, and as Todd said earlier, last year we discussed the why of genomics, why we should embrace molecular medicine, and what are the opportunities, and what do we stand to lose if we don't. Tonight we're going to explore the how. How do we incorporate the latest genomic science into New Zealand's healthcare system in an equitable and collaborative way? And if we do, what are the benefits both economically and in saving lives? Well, to help answer these questions, I'd like to welcome our panel this evening to the stage. If you guys want to just come on up, and I will do your intros as you are ascending to the stage. So, first of all, I'd like to say kia ora to Huti. Huti Watson is the General Manager of Ngāti Porou Oranga Centre of Excellence and a Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Fellowship for Social Equity. She has a strong focus on the protection of Māori rights and the integration of traditional knowledge in biomedical sciences in Aotearoa. Kia ora. Ben Te Aika has a background in Mātou Raka Māori, which is Māori Knowledge Framework, and Māori Economic Development. Ben's currently Māori Research Relationships Manager at the University of Otago and the chairperson of the Māori Data Leadership Group at ESR. He's the former project manager for Aotearoa, a pathfinder for genomic medicine in Aotearoa. Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora. Dr. Ben Lawrence is a medical oncologist at Auckland Hospital, where he cares for people with gastrointestinal cancers and neuroendocrine tumours. He's head of the Department of Oncology at Waipapa Taumata Row, University of Auckland. He's part of a governance group developing a new model of cancer care to take centrally coordinated care closer to patients by integrating knowledge and skills of Māori, university research and the health system. And finally, Professor David Thomas. Welcome, David, from afar, from over the ditch. He is the inaugural director of the Centre for Molecular Oncology at the University of New South Wales and head of the Genomic Cancer Medicine Lab at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research. He's also the Chief Executive Officer at Omico, a national precision medicine program for patients with rare and early onset cancers. As a clinician scientist, he uses genomic technologies to better understand and manage cancer. So in this first session, we're going to outline some of the problems. What are the challenges today here in Aotearoa when it comes to molecular medicine, both in primary health, but also in the hospital? And Huti, let's start with you, because this is an area you've been looking at. What are some of the challenges in primary health today? What are some of the problems?
Kia ora, Simon. Tēnā tātou katoa. He mihi tuatahi ki tō tātou pāpa ko hinga i tērā wiki ki Waiwhetu. Rātou ki rātou, tātou ki tātou, nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. He mihi hoki kia tātou katoa ko tai mai nei. Ko hikurangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa ko Ngāti Porou te iwi. Tētahi atu taha ōku, ko moihau te maunga, tikapa te wana, ko Ngāti Maru te iwi, nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. So I'm just going to quickly give a disclaimer. I always give a disclaimer before I start. I'm not here to represent iwi Māori. I'm just here to represent the views of our iwi, Ngāti Porou. I just want to give a little bit of context, first of all, Simon. First of all, Ngāti Porou Hauora is, Oranga actually is our new name. We are a Māori health provider. We deliver primary healthcare services to our tribal area from Pōtaki to Pōtikirua ki te Toka Taio, which is about 220 kilometres of landscape. And also, we also have an in-house centre of excellence. So we've engaged in genomic research for some 17 years now. We have a very strong relationship with Otago University. It was initiated firstly by Dr. Paratene Ngata and Professor Tony Merriman. And they started out our first project with the genetics of gout and related conditions. And we've also participated in a number of other genomic research since then. So that's a bit about our context. So our drivers for being engaged in genomic research is not only to derive some benefit from the research itself, but at the time we were very anxious not to be left behind in this space. And also being a population where I guess we experience very stark inequities. So we didn't want genomic medicine or precision medicine to be another inequity that was going to be our lot in the future. The challenges that we're facing now at the moment, after all of these 17 years of the engagement in research, firstly, is the accumulated data that we have. So we have a wonderful relationship with Otago. Our data's been stored there all this time. We have worked through an extra layer of agreement that we call the Kaitiaki agreement with Otago, and we've had this wonderful kind of long-term trusted partnership with Otago. And that's where our data's been stored. But for the long term, it's not the solution in the long term for us. Since then, we've lost Professor Tony Merriman to the United States. His lab is now closed. Our data is safe, but so what, now what? And so that's the challenge for us. We do worry about this every day. You know, what are we going to do? How are we going to apply all of that we've learned, and how we're going to utilise that data? So the loss of Tony Merriman has been a real... It's had a huge impact on us. And of course, we shouldn't be reliant on individuals. You know, I think, and this is the whole point about the need for a long-term infrastructure. So that's the second challenge I was going to talk about, was the lack of infrastructure to facilitate the research. For example, during the Aotearoa project, which you'll see a little bit more about very soon, we had to send our samples to the Garvan Institute in Australia. And of course, this made us think, okay, what happens to our data and our samples when it goes offshore? It means that our tiriti rights no longer exist. And so then we had to work through with Garvan, you know, how is this going to be managed? Who's going to say the karakia? What will happen to the data afterwards? And, you know, wonderfully, we were very fortunate, again, through personal relationships, that we were able to work this through with Garvan. And once they sent our samples home, they destroyed the data. So we were happy to do this. Now, one of the reasons why we're so strict over our data is that when the idea of research among Aotearoa began in 2006, Dr. Paratene Ngata consulted extensively among the iwi, and Ngāti Porou Oranga have the mandate to care for that data, to care for what happens to it, to maintain data sovereignty over it, including the publications and everything else that emerges from it. So we take that responsibility very seriously. So the model we have participated in recently that Ben's going to talk about with you, I think it might be in the next session, is Aotearoa for us is a bit of a solution. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. Kia ora. Thank you, Simon.
I'm intrigued, why have we ended up relying on individuals, the manner of individuals opposed to institutions? What's happening there?
Well, I think that that's the next step. You know, I mean, obviously, we are looking towards a national infrastructure where our tiriti rights and our considerations and our tikanga are embedded in that infrastructure. And I think that's what you'll see very soon once we get to talk a little bit more about Aotearoa.
Ben, would you like to shine a light on what's happening in the tertiary and the hospital setting? What's happening there in terms of challenges, problems that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis? Because you are dealing with patients on a day-to-day basis, aren't you?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So, kia ora koutou. My name's Ben Lawrence. I'm a medical oncologist up in Auckland, and I'm also a translational cancer researcher. So with Professor Chris Print, who some of you will know in Auckland, we run some sequencing research. And when we first started this about 10, 11 years ago, the first thing we did was we were super enthusiastic. You know, the promise of precision medicine is enormous, and so we imagined that we were going to sequence these tumours, and we focused on a particular type of cancer called neuroendocrine cancer. We'd discover the weaknesses in that cancer and be able to target them with different kinds of medication, or it might change the way we do surgery and all of those sorts of things. So the first thing we did when we created this project was to start consulting the community. And the first thing, part of that was to call a hui with Māori academics in the Tamaki Makaurau region. And we said this grand plan, with our big vision, and the first person stood up and said, thank you very much for that talk, and you do know, don't you, that what you're going to do is going to make inequity worse. And that was the beginning. And on the outside, I was cool and calm, and on the inside, I was like, no way, here we are. We're the super well-meaning Pākehā researchers. What could possibly go wrong here? And of course, she was completely right. And we were really lucky that we were led through a co-design process of a roadmap for safe travel by Kimi Ora-Hinare, who's a biomedical scientist in Auckland. And I think we've done okay. It's a very transparent process where we rate Kimi and ourselves, we rate ourselves publicly on a website of where we're doing okay and not on a traffic light system, red, orange, green, and call ourselves to account. But that's just one little tiny part. And in the meantime, this has evolved in research and in the clinical environment without any structure. So that has meant that without consciousness about equity and how this is delivered, sequencing and the delivery of trial medications that match the sequence that you find has not gone equally across the community, and the benefits of that. One small example is that I do a little bit of private. I'm a deeply public oncologist at heart, but I do a little bit of private. And when I look after people with gastrointestinal cancers, bowel cancers, one of the cancers I look after. Quite a common situation is a metastatic bowel cancer. When I started private 10 years ago, there was no difference in the care that I gave. It was the same, but the patient, wanted to, might have liked me, so they stuck with me, or they looked my name up in a phone book, who knows. But that continuity was what they got. Unfortunately now, 10 years on, actually there is a difference in the care, and there's a difference in the outcome. My private patients live a year longer in private than in public, and that breaks my heart in terms of what we're providing. And so the way I try to get around that in the public system is by getting access to sequencing through research projects and through new drugs through clinical trials, and sometimes we can make up that difference. For example, of the 4 medicines that are commonly used, 3 of them are available in Auckland at the moment in a clinical trial at no cost to the patient. But there's huge inequity in that, because that's Auckland. We have 40-odd trials open at the moment, but that opportunity is not evenly spread across the country. In the 6 major cancer hubs, 2, Palmerston North and Dunedin, have recently closed their cancer trial units, temporarily, hopefully. But all of a sudden, this inequity is massively exaggerated, so I think, summarising the things I've just been saying there, Simon, you get this. If you're starting with precision medicine, you need to design a system which is equitable from the very beginning. You need to. Clinical trials are a big part of this, and we need to. But at the moment, that's also another source of inequity that needs central leadership, and I'm really pleased to hear that, and I know some of the really good people working hard on this in Manatū Hauora and in Te Aho Te Kahu, but we need to keep working together.
But is there a danger that getting it equitable and getting it right is actually slowing down potentially our ability to seize the technology and actually implement it? There's a fine line there. You spend a lot of time working out protocols and making sure everyone's happy, and you've got this rampant technology that's happening out there.
I guess the vision is that everybody's health improves with technology over time, but it's got to be all of us, and we've got a lot of work to do just to particularly for whānau Māori to design a system which will achieve the outcomes that are the same for non-Māori. And I guess personally I value that extremely highly, and yes, it's a bit of both. It's a balance, isn't it? We want to improve. We want to close the gap for Māori, but we want to take everybody forward as well, take Māori forward as well.
Danger of moving too fast? Huti, what do you perceive that to be, of just saying, well, let's just get the technology, let's get it going, let's forget the protocols, let's just swab everyone, send it off to the data bank in the sky and start actually working out what's going on in the community and save lives?
Well, definitely, you'll leave the communities behind. They won't engage. And of course, there's already resistance and a lot of suspicion, lack of trust, particularly around research, but more so around genomic research. And so, people and organisations and companies will simply be seen as opportunists. So, you've got to take your community with you, and that is exactly what, has been happening with us, with Otago, University of Auckland, the research that we're doing there. As Tiriti partner as well, we insist that we be partners with the advancement of this.
David, interested to get your take on this. Does this all sound a bit familiar? Yours, Omiko is you're ahead of the game. You've been doing this. You were established in 2019, although earlier you said it's a project that's been sort of gestating for years and years. What's your take on the challenges that have been expressed this evening?
Well, they're not new. I think most healthcare systems managing cancer patients in particular are faced with how they evolve, and health systems are not designed to be skittish or rapidly changeable. This is one of the features of health systems, that they're conservative, they rely upon retrospective evidence. It's, I think, a really important concept that everybody in the audience should understand, that for cancer at any rate, what's happening now is not a question of a technology or a test or a particular drug. It's a conceptual framework for the leading cause of death in higher income countries. Nothing less dramatic than that. And there is no part of care of cancer patients, from early detection, prevention, all the way through to diagnosis, treatment and cure, hopefully, but in the longer term, management disease that can't be cured, that is not affected by genomics, because cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease. The last big change, to put this into perspective, occurred 170 years ago, and we're still using that classification system to manage cancer today. Is it surprising that a development, an advance of such a fundamental kind is not going to challenge systems about how they adapt to it? And trying to squeeze it into the conventional model of going through, in Australia, the PBAC or MSAC to get a test done or get a particular drug is missing the point. We're dealing as clinicians today with a fundamentally different universe from when I started as a doctor 30 years ago, when I was padding around the wards, managing patients who were vomiting themselves for 3 days because we were using cytotoxic therapies, which we needed to manage. Today, we have rationally designed drugs because we understand what makes cancers tick. And that environment is having an enormous impact upon survival. So I would say that's the first thing. Like any rapidly moving field, I think early adopters drive those individuals, those sort of cottage industry. People are simply responding to opportunity to drive forward themselves personally this field. And that's what we observe right around the world, is researchers, medical research grants driving forward this field. But at some point it's got to mature. You've got to go from the ad hoc heroic phase led by champions to something that is institutionalised within the healthcare system itself. The trick is the how. As you've talked about, I think virtually nowhere in the world has managed all of the elements of the how that will make it affordable, sustainable and equitable. But the potential is absolutely enormous. There's no question. Today, the management of cancer patients, if it's done properly, can increase the chance of response 6-fold compared to what it was like even 20 years ago. So the question is not whether it will do any good, the question is how we make sure it happens, in my view. I can talk about how we started off in Australia and did that historically, but that in essence I think is the challenge for all health systems globally.
And just give us a little bit of background on Omiko in terms of the structure. What is it? What do you guys do?
Yeah, so it all began 15 years ago when genomics was clearly becoming a really cancer genetic disease. Genomics is a fundamental technology. It cost $3 billion to sequence the first person. Now we can do it for like $1,500. In fact, it's probably going to drop to $200 for a whole genome, which is an absolutely extraordinary reduction in cost and deployment. As a clinician, we wanted to make sure that we had access to that technology and to do so in a way that would benefit patients, which means we were doing genomics, but we were also trying to develop interventions based on the genomics so that we could treat the patients from whom we were learning, create a virtuous system in which the patients participated to help us understand the disease, but we could also go back to them and say, hey, look, what we've learned is that we can do something about it, and that's the potential of it all. When we started to do that, we started off by doing genomics in 4 centres in Victoria in 2011. When I went up to New South Wales, we expanded that in New South Wales, but this time we started to build in trials. So we had this basket trial design that we built on the genomics, so we were treating people as well as testing people. And eventually we had people, a High Court judge travelling from Western Australia with metastatic disease to get onto the program, and we made a case federally that we didn't want people travelling 4,000 kilometres to get treatment. It should be a national program, and then that required us to do something I never expected to do, which was to create a non-profit company to unite all the 8 states and territories into a credible national program, an entity that could be the recipient of federal investment to deliver this new model of care equitably right across the country. And that's how Omiko came about. But it's taught me a lot about the use of corporate structures to deliver social enterprises of this scale. Some things you need separate experimental system for the system itself. And I think what we've created is a safe environment, almost like a statutory body, in which the system can play with how it interacts with all the stakeholders necessary to realise the benefits of precision medicine.
Why wouldn't we let the market just sort this out? I'm intrigued that obviously there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of co-investment, it's expensive technology. Why don't you let the market sort of work out?
Well, there are 2 answers to that. Broadly speaking, it's exactly the same problem as climate change. Some things are simply too important and too complicated to be left either to the public sector or to the private sector. You can't do without both. And what is happening in practice is that the private sector, realising that this is a game-changing conceptual advance in a disease which kills more people than any other disease in our community, they're investing trillions. The private sector is investing trillions of dollars in this model of rational drug development based around a molecular concept of cancer. Public systems are much more nervous about it because they don't know how to afford it. If you look at health as a fraction of GDP in every country around the world, it's rising year on year. It's a general problem that science is actually working. It's actually working to deliver better outcomes, but we haven't got an integrated model for how all the stakeholders operate so that we have problems of affordability. And I think that's why we need to radically rethink the relationship between all the stakeholders that are critical to delivering those health benefits. And it's not a question of doing trials, it's not a question of doing genomics and bioinformatics, it's a question of thinking about the system and trying to work out how to bring together all the parties without whom we simply cannot treat patients. And it's not just about treatment of patients, I should say. So Omiko has a therapeutic side, which is kind of what I'm focused on at the moment, but it also has a germline side, because I think understanding why people get cancer, because of the genes they inherit, is just as important as the treatment of patients with incurable disease. Like I said, there's no part of cancer care that is not affected, from public health all the way through to the looking after an individual who is dying from that disease.
Pretty good reason not to go to the market. It sounds convincing. Hey, thank you so much, guys. And we're going to have a bit of a break now for some food, for some kai, and then we're going to come back. We've got another couple of sessions. Ben, would you like to add something? Because you actually have you got anything before? Are you okay? Because you've got a bit to fill in the next session. But yeah, we'll be come back in 20 minutes, and we're going to look at some initiatives and what's actually happening on the ground in a bit more HD here in Aotearoa. Kia ora. Thank you. Okie dokes. So this is our second session, and then we are heading into dessert. Then we've got a final session where we'll open up to some Q&A. But for this next session, we really want to look at the response here in New Zealand. What's actually happening around the motu? And maybe I'll start with you, Ben Lawrence, in terms of what's happening in your world. Take us in there just briefly.
Thanks, Simon. So I think the first thing to recognise with precision oncology, and I'm sorry I'm a bit cancer-focused, Huti, this is much bigger, but just focusing on cancer just for a moment, is that it's not new and it's not the future. It's been happening now for a long time, and we've been doing it in New Zealand for at least 10 years, through workarounds mostly. I was just mentioning to Simon before, and Simon says it sounds like a hustle, and that's a part of my job, is to sort of run this hustle. How am I going to get genomic information about people's cancers to change their care? So I'll just tell you about 2 patients that I've seen over the last week. The first, on Thursday, I saw a 41-year-old Pacifica man and his family. He'd just been diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer. We spent an hour together with him and his whānau packed into this little room, the clinic room. We got to know each other, worked out what was important to him. He wanted to try as much treatment as he could. He had young kids. I explained to him what the treatment options were, which is chemotherapy. And his sister said, "And what else?" And I said, "Well, we could sequence the tumour to see if there's any other targets, and there might be a clinical trial." At the moment, unfortunately, the way the sequencing works, in my head, this is the maths. So there's 10 genes that commonly change bowel cancer treatment, that define our treatment. All hospitals in New Zealand test 4 of them, and we will do a workaround. We don't do a gene test, we test the protein, because it's been around for longer. They're called mismatch repair genes. The 5th gene is BRAF. Some hospitals test the protein. Some do a test called mass array, which is testing a smaller number of genes, usually about 5, of which 3 of the 10 are in that little test. So far, we've spent $150 per IHC stain. That's $662 for the mass array test. So that's where are we up to? You can do the maths, 1,200 and something. And then there are 3 other genes which are not. We don't have any way of testing them. And so we talked about that, and they said, "Well, how do we get those tests?" And I said, "Well, we don't have a test for that. That's something you would have to pay for. Costs a few $1,000s." And the brother on the other side said, "That's fine. I'll pay for it." And that's the reaction from most Pacifica families that I look after. That's the reaction. They want the information, and the whānau will work it around and make it work and find a way. So the hustle here is that we combine different types of testing, not real genomics. We spend quite a lot of money in the public health system and money out of pocket from the whānau themselves. And yet we could do a genomic test, as David was saying, for the same cost as all of these workarounds, in fact cheaper when you look at to the family, especially if we scale it up and we're doing a lot of these testing as we go. So that was the first patient. The second patient was someone I saw who has been part of, she's in her early 20s. She had been part of, she had a type of cancer that I look after, neuroendocrine cancer, a very aggressive version of it. I remember the day when I met her, and it was a tough conversation for her and her family, and for me. She was 21, and I had to explain to her that usually this is not a cancer that you can survive. In fact, ever, really. So she had all sorts of chemotherapy. She always responded, the cancer always disappeared almost, and then it bounced back a few months later. And she had some operations and lots of chemo, and we got to the end of the road where we didn't have any other options to go to. But she'd been part of the sequencing study I mentioned earlier in the previous session. And we sequenced her cancer, and the first thing that was blindingly obvious is that it wasn't a neuroendocrine cancer. It was something completely different and unusual. In fact, it was a sarcoma. And so all of a sudden, we've been giving her the wrong treatment. She had 3 operations, 2 years of chemotherapy. And so we did a stem cell transplant, and that was 3 years ago, and I saw her on Tuesday. She was a nursing student at the time I met her. She finished a year ago. She's running the ward, coordinating a paediatric ward, which is not a good idea as a second year nurse, but that's the way things are at the moment. But such a capable young woman. Yeah, I mean, you should meet this woman. She's amazing. So the moral of that story is you just needed the sequence. And the other thing is that sequencing doesn't just change your treatment, it doesn't match to a drug. Of the first 70 neuroendocrine patients we sequenced, 4 weren't neuroendocrine. it turned out that they were different types of pancreas cancer and other things with completely different treatment, and we were able to change the treatment. And that was surgical treatment, not medical oncology treatment. So finally, the other thing I just wanted to share is that, so this is the hustle, right? We're trying to find sequencing, this is through research projects, we're trying to make it free for patients. We're really lucky that a philanthropist in Auckland has seen the value in a precision approach, and a really key part of that is this thing called a molecular tumour board. So you do the sequencing, but so what? You've got a big string of numbers. You need a bioinformatician who can decide what that variant means, where the mistake is, and which gene and which part of the genome. You need a biologist who can say that's biologically important or not. You need an oncologist who can say, or a clinical person who can match that to the existing literature out there, just to match that variant to a drug. David will talk about this as an amazingly huge molecular tumour board program, which goes through very fast. We've done a workaround, which is a philanthropically funded, university-run project, so we can now take these sequences and turn them into a clinical decision for our patients. But it's dependent on our research team, basically. The same team that did all the sequencing for neuroendocrine tumours has fortunately hung around and using their expertise now for all cancer types. So we've got something that's tenuous, inequitable, because it's only in Auckland, but entirely scalable. And that expertise exists in New Zealand, and we can grow more of it, and we can grow these people if that's something we wanted to do as a nation.
So what's the barrier? Why isn't it happening?
Well, we need, as I said before, we need to start this at scale, and we need to have central leadership. We want to be able to make sure this is available to everybody, no matter where they live, and there's cost as well. The skills, it's so fast moving, is that you have to be constantly adapting and changing. And we've been incredibly lucky in the sequencing we've done, is that we've done some locally, but we haven't been able to keep up. We've had some technical problems. We've partnered with industry for from some parts of this, who've provided some of this sequencing, and we would not have been able to do it without them. And I think that I come from a traditional New Zealand doctor training background, which is public service, university research. But I guess the reason I'm here is that we have to do this together with all parts of the community, which includes industry. There's the knowledge, the energy, the ability to change and flex, I think, has to be part of the solution. So I think to answer your question, there's a few barriers, but we need to put our heads together and run this properly and set it up for everyone.
We'll have a look at some of those structures and opportunities after dessert. But before we get there, Ben Te Aika, I'm keen to get your take, because the volume of data, the amount of data, the sources of data, the protocols, and you've explored this, haven't you, within Rakiora. What have you implemented? Talk to us about data. If I give you my data, what's happening to it?
So generally our kia ora tātou ko Ben Te Aika tōku e koa no kaia poi ahau. Taku mihi atu ki a koutou, ko aoraki, ko maukitere, ko taranaki oku mau, ka teitei, mihi atu ki a koutou. Haku hoa, haku rakitira o te whare nei hoki. Kia ora tātou. Can we hear me now? Good question. What's happening with our data? So I was introduced to this world a few years ago now, 5 maybe, through genomics. Aotearoa at Otago University. I was the Vision Mātauraka coordinator there. We're developing a data repository with partnership from all of our stakeholders, our partners. And I was blessed to be surrounded by neat people and deep thinkers to how to problem solve data repository and accessibility, along with not only Māori data sovereignty, but aspects of thinking around national data sovereignty as well. What is important to the nation state and what is important to Takata Whenua as well. So 2 categories we identified of that fit this realm of sovereignty, which sort of went against open source, open data philosophy, a global context of sharing data with the push of a button. Everyone has access to it, and then the Twitter wars will start, and we'll debate the thinking around whatever data we're looking at. So there's tension there, but we understood and heard from our researchers around the value of other people's input into analysis work from across the globe and reaching those great minds. And some of them came over from the Netherlands and helped us out with a whole bunch of thinking, and Nick and his team at Nessie as well, to help structure this. And I was fortunate to be part of the development of the access protocols from a Māori perspective. So we brought up a new philosophy around, instead of open access, it's managed access. So creating protocols for application to our data where people could still access and work with our data, but it was done in a managed way that met our criteria as Māori. And it started off in that realm with Nessie in taonga species and environmental data, important to Māori, and then rapidly, again with Nessie through Aotearoa, we started building systems around human data. So it's quite exciting in partnership with Ngāti Porou Hauora. So in saying that, I'll quickly, which one have I got here? So yeah, really a treaty proposition-based rationale for everything we were doing within that context. And while you've got those slides to look at, I would like to say that New Zealand's a world leader in Indigenous genomics, and we're being viewed by other countries. So, and other Indigenous people are looking to us. We look to them, of course, as well. We're learning lessons off each other, but people don't realise that New Zealand has that positioning on the global stage, and it's an exciting place to be. So,
Huti showed me a graphic earlier of connecting data to an identifier in primary care. So a patient going into a doctor and linking the doctor having access to those records. And the graphic, I've got to say, I said don't put it up because it scared me. There were so many boxes and it was a flow chart from hell. But obviously a lot of substance there and a lot of issues you work through in terms of the data flow and how that's going to work and authentication and who has access, but it works.
Yeah, well, I guess the Rākei order is really about research. You know, it's not necessarily delivery of clinical delivery. That's another model, which I think the Rākei order model can perhaps be a formal basis for. But so we tracked one gene, CYP2C19, from sample all the way through the process, research how those workflows are going to run. We didn't want people to be able to take data out, so people have to set up their workflow. And Nessie, of course, they're the experts, they can probably talk about that. They get permissioning, they need to get visas to access the data, they run their workflow and then take their results out. And of course, all of those kaitiaki consents and permissioning processes and tikanga is involved in all of that. But we wanted to be able to see how this tracks by the, just tracking one gene all the way through to the patient and to their doctor. And I think, for the first time in Ngāti Porou, after all these years of research, we actually had, a researcher turn up and say, well, all these letters have gone out to people and, here's the results. Does that gene inhibit the uptake of particular drugs, for you as an individual? The doctor is informed. And so, that process right from woe to go was really important, and it was exciting for us because for the first time we'd actually seen that take place for us. And so we know what's possible, and that was only one gene though. And so for all of the work that we've done over the years, we know that at least there are at least 50 variants in our population that seem to be unique to us. There's a lot of work to be done. So one of them in particular I wanted to raise tonight was the, and Peter might correct me on this, I think it's called the SLC 22A3, if I got it right, which inhibits the uptake of metformin, actually. And so, you know, that's present in our population. 20 to 30% of people have that. And so where does that take us from here? You know, where do we go from here with that information?
And David, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around treatment, and I think there's a danger here that we actually only look at the genomic and molecular medicine with the treatment lens, where it really is about prevention, isn't it? I mean, that's the case here with the metformin. It's about if we can screen populations and actually say, well, they're not going to respond to that drug, or this drug's actually going to do damage, then you've got that whole prevention side, which often gets forgotten.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. Just say one thing, that you are correct. The Maori management of data and genomics is a world-class example. I would love to spend more time understanding how to do that well in Australia. We have challenges there ourselves, and it's an important part of our equity strategy. Yes, so cancer's a disease which, if caught early, can be cured. That's the whole principle behind breast screening and bowel screening programs that are already well and widely used. But everybody in this room has a different risk of having cancer, and some people have a lower than average risk, and some people have a higher than average risk, and some people have an extreme risk. And we're focused on that tip of the most extreme risk, but probably rather than screening every woman at the age of 50 every 2 years with a mammogram, which is the case in Australia, some women need to be screened at 40 and some may not need to be screened until 60. And it's that sort of future that I think is going to occur. And it's going to go beyond breast and bowel screening, because there are technologies like whole body magnetic resonance imaging, which can detect cancers no matter where they arise. And that will start to democratize the use of screening strategies beyond the 20 or 30% of cancers that arise in the breast and the bowel. And that's the future that's ahead of us. I think personalized risk management. Cardiovascular disease taught us this. Cardiovascular disease used to be the leading cause of death in all higher income countries until about 2017. And it fell, mortality dropped by 60%. And it dropped in large part because of management of risk. And that was because we had a biomarker of risk called cholesterol and hypertension. And we managed the cholesterol and we managed the hypertension. And so we put off the age at which those events, the heart attacks and strokes, occurred. We can do the same thing for cancer, because cancer is a genetic disease, and genomics is the cholesterol test for cancer risk. At a population level, that's what we need to do. And I think as a general, another comment to make about Maori in particular is, right around the world, sequencing of Caucasian populations has saturated itself. You know, we understand a lot about, there are 100,000 genomes in the broad databases, for example. What's being recognized is that we need to start sequencing non-Caucasian populations to understand what the human race consists in. And of course, there are other things that come from all of that, which is just fantastic, like drug metabolism. You know, there are so many drugs where one person's reaction is very different from another. We use a blunderbuss at the moment. Our programs involve several thousand people who've got early onset cancer. We cure 85% of those people. And our programs are designed to ask, well, what happens if we didn't just say, congratulations, we've cured you, back into the community at the age of 35, and to get your next cancer at the age of 45, but rather understood why they got the cancer and, if possible, what you can do about it. And there are so many benefits that will flow from that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
I was going to say it's cost savings as well. Can't afford not to do it.
Hi, one of the other things we tried to do at Aotearoa is get different data sets talking across each other and integrating, looking from tertiary care to primary care, integrating those systems which are usually pretty firewalled and different software packages, etc., talking to each other, then for analysis purposes and outcomes for community. So a big part of this was the experience that Ngāti Porou have in working in this space and taking that to the communities and getting the buy-in at grassroots level, which supported the kaimahi to serve their interests, and now we've got a whole community who know genomics, know it's seen that there's benefits, and have built trust with our research teams and with their leadership and service providers. So that was a big part of the package, learning now from the COVID experience, those other voices can occupy space when we're not filling it with fact and knowledge and trust and understanding, which brings the social licence to bear and supports the mahi to happen. So that, I can't emphasise that enough, and it links then to the data management as well, which in our system is, and it's not the only approach, there'll be others out there, because other iwi will have their mana and their own way of doing things. But what we developed was a embryo for a federated system with regional permissioning, and which linked it as close as we can back to the originator of the data. And new technologies are emerging to enable that even more. So when a community's educated into the science, they can get excited about their healthcare and feel empowered about decision making on their information and their data, and support the kaimahi to do that on their behalf. So that was a big part of the underlying philosophy for Aotearoa. I just call for another slide. So part of that, just might as well stand over here. We called that co-design, co-delivery. Ngāti Porou Hauora then, now Oranga, were heavily partnered in this project and took responsibility for things in relation to their people, data management and decision making. A big part of this was the makeup of the team. Some really good people with egos that were left at the door, and service-orientated practitioners within research and clinical practice as well. So it was very real for the team, and a big part of this, for those who I don't think everyone can see, a big part of that is our whakapapa. So we see genomics and data as a physical manifestation and digital manifestation of our whakapapa. So it's inherent in us and for us, for our future generations. So we're very conscious of that across the board. What will our great-great-grandchildren think about the decisions we're making today, and how does that affect them? And so everyone was on board with an underlying philosophy from the get-go. And that was the thing that really knitted us together. And trying to bring that back to local decision making, so there's much higher rate of or presence of transparency and accountability back to our people. Then trust forms.
Kia ora, Ben. Well, time for some dessert, and in our final session we'll have questions and answers, so we'd love some questions from the floor, and we're also going to look at a call to action, so hopefully there'll be some action out of this dinner. Apart from us all going home well fed, someone's going to take the torch and run with it, because it sounds pretty compelling that we need to do something. It's just not fair. Anyway, enjoy your dessert. Don't get too down. Okay, so in this final session, before we take questions from the floor, we will have a couple of microphones. So if I could ask, if you do have a question, make sure you have a mic in your hand so it's recorded.
You can have mine.
But before we do the Q&A session, I guess it's really a time to sort of talk about the future and what we're going to do. And David, you're ahead of the game at Omico, and interested to get your thoughts on where do we need to focus our energies locally? What's the action? What's the call to action here?
Well, so you're going to have to take it with a grain of salt. I'm obviously ignorant, and what I would like to do is to focus on what I think are the general principles that are required for us to be able to do what we hope to be able to achieve. So we've gone now through 8,000 patients in our program, and we will be doing another 23,000 going forward. Patients with advanced cancer, no treatment options that we've been doing profiling on, and then putting on to match therapies. I'm astonished to say this, but 37.5% of those patients, when we test them, 37.5, Ben, that's an incredible number. It used to be 5% only 5-6 years ago. 37.5 have a tier 1 to 3 treatable biomarker. Tier 1 to 3, don't worry about that, that's a technological term, but suffice to say, it's clinical evidence that it will, if you can treat the patients, they will have an extension of survival. In our own program, the survival in that population is doubled from 8 months in a phase 1 population. Remember, this is a patient population that's reached the end of their treatment options, to 18 months. If it was a drug, it would be approved in almost every jurisdiction in the planet. That's the magnitude of the effect on survival for the patients in whom you find a target, which is more than a third of the patients in that situation, simply by doing the testing. But the trick is treatments. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Access to drugs is absolutely critical. The testing is trivial, technically trivial, and even financially trivial. How you get people treated is the really challenging bit. We've decided to go the route of trying to increase clinical trials. And so I was dismayed to hear you say, Ben, that of the 6 centres, there are 2 that have not got clinical trials active, because clinical trials, in my view, are a way to have patients access treatments without having to go through the expensive business of working out how you pay at the end of it. That's a very complicated story, which I think needs to be addressed, and it is something that is challenging to all systems, but assisting in access to clinical trials is absolutely critical. Why trials? Why should trials be a standard of care? Because the response rate, even on a phase 1 study today, if you get that tier 1 to 3 patient to a drug that's designed, even before you've tested the drug, in a phase 1 study, is 30%, which is 6-fold higher than it used to be in phase 1 in the 1990s, and remains 5 to 6% today when you treat with an old-fashioned chemotherapy in a phase 1 study. And that's because the concept that I was talking about at the beginning, the Bayesian prior, statistically speaking, of using science to design a drug actually works. And even in phase 1, you've got a response rate from taking part in a trial which is higher than the frontline response rate to doxorubicin for a patient with metastatic soft tissue sarcoma, which is 17 to 23%. So it's the drug that we use for every single sarcoma patient who's got advanced incurable disease. We give them doxorubicin, and it has a 17 to 23% response rate. They should be on a phase 1 study. So the question is, how do you increase clinical trials activity? And the first thing that's obvious is you cannot treat a patient without working with industry. I'm public like Ben. I'm working from the public sector. We've created a company which is a non-profit precisely to do this, but we have to work with all the stakeholders which are essential to treating patients. And once you accept that, then we reasoned, why not get industry to pay for the screening, because we're supporting screening because that's necessary for the trials, as well as providing the drugs for free in the trials. And to do that proposition, which I think is appealing to industry, because, and this is an incredible statistic, of the 841 oncology drugs in development in 2018, 91% were rationally designed against a target. When you test that in a clinical population, you need to be able to identify the target, or you won't know whether the drug works. It's designed to target a particular molecule in those patients. So as a country, as an environment, as an ecosystem to attract clinical trials for drug development into our country, we needed to start providing molecular profiling. And once you do that, you create a gravitational effect to be able to draw, it becomes permissive. Otherwise, they'll just do it at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where they've got screening being done at an institution level. We want them to come to our country. We want them to come to New Zealand. And so in an era of rational drug development, you have to provide molecular profiling. And then you have to think about how you run clinical trials. And there are a whole lot of elements that are really quite critical in Australia. The first thing is that commercially sponsored trials are actually better than academic trials because there's more money attached to them. And by doing those trials, you not only treat patients, but you inject resources into a cash-strapped system. You can get benefit for patients directly by treating on trials, but you can also, in effect, grow the economy. And this brings me to my economic argument. If there's one thing that COVID has taught us, it is that for the most part, we perceive health as an expenditure portfolio, which can only, you have to pay for it, and it comes at the expense of the economy. Worldwide, that was the message out of COVID. We shut down our borders, we tolerated the damage to our economies because we were protecting health. But the life sciences economy in the 21st century is one of the biggest industries on the planet. 15 of the top 50 R&D spenders globally are pharmaceutical companies. Number 8 in that list, which I can't mention because I'm apparently allowed to mention individual companies' names, spends 12 billion Swiss francs a year on R&D. Just below, well, there's a number of companies it could be, so I'll just leave it at that. Just below Apple. Now, if you said we're going to attract into our country Apple to set up its working environment in Australia or in New Zealand, everybody would go, great, that's really innovative, that's high tech. Well, the health sector, the pharmaceutical industry is like that. And the trick is, as a public health physician, I want to see that happen because I want to see medical research being translated. There's a valley of death about commercialization of those ideas, which you could have a Silicon Valley effect if you had more companies present that were willing to take up those ideas and push them through the drug development process. That would generate at the very front end of the value generation chain. You'd end up with good things that were from it. But more importantly, you'd have patients having access to drugs in a more affordable way. And ultimately, I like to think of this as an integrated chain, right? So we've got Pharmac or PBAC or MSAC at the end of that process, where we have to pay for things. If we work with industry to make drug development itself cheaper, we'll pay less at the end. And in the middle, more people will be treated because they're taking part in the trials that we ourselves can support. And I know that clinicians want to do medical research. We don't want people like Tony Merriman going overseas because they can do things overseas that they may not be able to do here. That's absolutely zero-sum game for all of us. So we need to create an environment in which to grow our society. We need to build certain sovereign capacities. And this is my final plea. I don't think, with the pace of change, certainly in oncology, and probably it's true for all of medicine, with the advances in genomics, in artificial intelligence, with rational drug development and things like AlphaFold, this incredibly efficient mechanism for predicting what sort of molecules are going to bind to targets, doing this instantaneously, what used to take 10 years, that anything is going to slow down. And the way we deal in a health system with uncertainty is to do it through research. So why not have research be part of our health system? And why not get all the stakeholders who would benefit from it to contribute? How do you do that? That's the question. And of course, there are certain natural sort of relationships between industry and the public sector which become problematic in that sense. You need a safe space, just as you need a safe environment in which to do clinical trials under consent, under very carefully regulated systems. We need to think about the system as needing an experimental framework. And in Australia, we had to create a company which was licensed to act on the public interest, to be the recipient of federal government funding, where we made the argument that industry partners would match that funding. We have a $200 million program which we've set up, which has started off only 3 months ago, offering screening to 23,000 Australians. But our most important task is to make the rest of the world that's doing drug development know that we exist and that Australia is a destination where we want to do trials. I want to see New Zealand as a partner in that process, take a regional approach. We're very happy to use the resources that we have with the industry connections that we build, the trials that we will attract in. We're happy to work with our partners in New Zealand to open those trials in Auckland, in Dunedin, around this country as well.
And Ngāti Pro.
And Ngāti Pro, exactly. And all of that is not pie in the sky. It has been enshrined in a contract, a commercial collaborative agreement, as a public-private partnership. I suspect that's a generalizable rule. You need a statutory agency which is tasked with the responsibility of working out how to do this, that is licensed to have the freedom that governments typically don't have, but to act in the national interest. And I would do it by creating a summit. I would call all the stakeholders into a room and say, we'll put money on the table, but we'll only put it there if you also put money into it, that you promise to commit increased drug trials to be brought into this country. And the beautiful thing about this from a financial perspective is this. If a company like whatever that hypothetical Swiss company was spends 12 billion Swiss francs a year, and they're spending, let's say hypothetically, 50 million in Australia, it costs virtually nothing for them to allocate a bit more of those research trials to Australia. They're actually not, there's no new money required. So what you're doing is saying, let us tempt you to do more of your trials in this country because you're innovative, you've got short trial activation times, you've got so many advantages as a country. Do the trials here because we're now providing that molecular screening which is fundamental to rational drug development. Come here and spend that money and we'll spend money. Let's both spend money, and let's do it with the national interest in mind. That's the principle behind Prospect, this $200 million program. It's an experiment. We'll see if it works. If it works, we'll be able to treat more patients. We'll support a data-driven life sciences economy in an area which is shovel-ready, has been shovel-ready for years, and where patients ultimately will be able to measure the benefits of them and also the cost of the system. We want to be able to demonstrate that the net pie grows from such a model rather than the zero-sum game of trying to fit more and more of science's advances into the same size pie, which is exactly, in a nutshell, the problem with health and GDP in every single-payer system around the world. And we're doing it as an innovative exercise. Let's be innovative together. Once we get a critical mass, I think a lot of other countries are watching to see how this experiment unfolds. That's my call to arms, call to action.
Wow.
What do you think, Ben?
Well, so what I think is that if we could do that through the lens of Aotearoa, then you've really got something that would work and would be unique to New Zealand. And if we could use the principles developed in Aotearoa to ensure that we could do this equitably, safely, with good data governance, then I think that sounds like a good plan. I should say that today's very exciting for me because I haven't met either of you guys before in person, but you're two of my personal heroes in terms of what you do in Australia and what you do in New Zealand. So, but I think of bringing together the work that you've done in one location, because I think the principles are right. Just in terms of you've mentioned Omako as a company, and you've mentioned a statutory body. Do you see Omako, the company, as a statutory body? Is that the?
We were just sneaky. So we had a choice between, so all of high-tech medicine gets deployed through hospitals. It's just where it starts. It's just the nature of science and clinical research. And the hospitals in Australia are funded by the states, and there are 8 states and territories, and they all have different characteristics and economies and political persuasions. So we had the option, okay, this is a no-brainer. Who wants to make a big difference fast and wants to go through 8 state and territory governments to achieve their end? Well, what we decided to do was to go straight to the hospitals. So we had a cancer centre in every state and territory who agreed to take part as members in the company that we created, a non-profit company, and we used that to demonstrate that we had national reach, and then we were able to be the object of federal government funding. And now we're 43 centres, because the appetite from the clinical community is absolutely massive, as you can understand for this. We're offering options for patients that just don't exist. Every clinician feels the way that Ben does when they have a 21-year-old who's got a terminal illness. We all hate it, and that's why we do research, and research works. So,
Is there an application on your website to open a branch down here, get some funding? I'm just wondering, can we piggyback? I mean, is there an opportunity for Omako to actually help us?
Of course. That would be absolutely. I have a desire to get a critical mass in the region, and 30 million puts us on par as a population with Canada. And Canada is not an insignificant population, but we're also small enough and nimble enough and creative enough to be able to be less bureaucratic than countries which are much larger in scale. It's the secret of the Scandinavian countries, is that sort of centralized control and small population sizes. We can do something similar in the Asia Pacific, and I guarantee that it will be one of the first models that, if it works, will be followed by many other jurisdictions around the world. We published a paper in the NPJ Precision Oncology in January of this year on this model because it's a novel idea that other people are interested in. And it's an idea which actually addresses a really fundamental problem, which is how do you sustain the advances of science, forgetting about the trials. You have to figure out a way to get the patients treated at the end of it all in a sustainable way. We have to rethink the whole paradigm, I think. And starting to work together is obviously a good place.
I was just going to say, David, so what kind of role did the government take in all of this?
That's a really important point, isn't it? So governments tend to be they're scared. They're scared by this GDP, this health and GDP. They don't know how to deal with the political imperatives to provide care, which is clearly being made elsewhere. But how do you pay for it in taxes? You've got so many demands on your taxpayer dollar. That's why we have to rethink the model. But governments, by backing that sort of innovation with the system itself, address that fundamental long-term problem that they face of sustainability of healthcare, and they also legitimise and effectively insure other investors by bankrolling it. You end up saying, in our case, we said, if we put 60 million on the table, will you put in 120 million? It's a no-brainer if a government's going to back what you're proposing as an experiment to contribute to the experiment. So I think governments have an opportunity to lead in this space, to legitimise and license other stakeholders to also co-invest. And the key thing is the coordination. It's this co-design idea that you were talking about. It's actually co-design for all the stakeholders which are essential to getting the best outcome for patients. And everybody has to be at the table because everybody's got a contribution to make.
What did that look like for you?
What is that co-design? I think that's Summit idea. Oh, well, so in Omiko, we ended up creating we were an applicant on behalf of about 23 stakeholders. They included philanthropic organisations, community organisations, biotech sector, genomics providers, but also the pharmaceutical sector. And what we're trying to do is, if we do the screening to find the patients that will enable faster conduct of trials, and that makes sense economically for industry, then industry will come into the country and do more of those trials. And our job is to market that, actually.
What I'm saying is, in terms of your relationship with government to back this,
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it took 10 years of progressively delivering on every outcome. I'm not suggesting that you start from scratch. This is like when we were starting. But you've got to think about it the way that governments think about it. Governments think about healthcare not just for individual patients where there's a tragedy, but about how you afford it, because there are so many competing. If you're thinking about things in terms of sustainability, I think most governments around the world are conscious that they have to come up with a better model. And if you're having a go at that model, people will invest in testing that model, and that includes governments.
Provocative stuff. I'm aware that the night is ticking on and we do have some questions, I'm sure, from the floor. Please wait till you receive the microphone. And in fact, here we go, the golden one.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Peter Shepherd. I'm a researcher who hasn't left New Zealand yet, and I'm still here. I daily ask myself why. And the reason I'm here is because we've got really important, unique problems for this country that need to be solved, and that I feel, as someone who grew up here and benefited from our education system here and came back to New Zealand from overseas, that I should stay. Should I? No, I don't want to collapse. I just want you to realise that I must be insane, because we've got a system in New Zealand where our government doesn't believe in science. It doesn't fund science. We have a budget for our Health Research Council on a per capita basis that is 1/10 of what the Americans fund with the NIH. About 1/4 of what the Australians fund for the NHMRC. And that has to cover so many different areas and so many unique health problems in our country. We don't even make an effort in this country. I'm sorry, if there are any politicians in this room, please be ashamed. You should be, because we do not invest in the research that is necessary to achieve these outcomes that we've been talking about today. We've now received an offer of international foreign aid from our Australian colleague as if we were a third world country. Well, we are. We are a third world country in this space. We don't fund our own health system for our own people and our own unique problems in this country. And the elephant in this room here is that none of this is achievable unless someone pays for it, and that someone has to be the government. And the government has to put in money to improve the research and the implementation of these new waves of medicine. Good on you for putting a tiny bit more into Pharmac. Wow, that's great. About 10 years too late, but better late than never. But
Can you get to your question? Just
right.
Because.
So my question to the panel is, how much do we need?
Well, I can tell you what's required to set this thing up. And in Australia, we had $20 million for setting up the basket trial that we set up, as well as the molecular profiling of what was originally 3,000 patients and ended up being 8,000 because of co-investment from industry. Industry will also tip in if it makes sense from their perspective. So if you were scaling that proportionately, you could probably set up a similar, and you didn't have to do the basket trials, you were just providing the molecular screening, and you had some other entity take responsibility for attracting commercial investment, maybe even setting up the summit, so you had agreement before you gave the money. You could get away with between $5 and $10 million would get you started, which is not a lot of money in anybody's.
Yeah, no, we don't have.
Well, I mean, I would say if you don't have a lot of money, then you need to make every buck go as far as possible. I'm not so pessimistic. I think it's about coming up with solutions. And as researchers, we're supposed to be really bright. I think it's for us to come up with solutions that actually resonate. And these are realities that that governments have to face. And if you come up with a solution that also meets their needs, they will release funds. Because you can demonstrate, in our case, you can demonstrate through taxes and jobs growth. We're actually accountable. Our funding didn't come from health. It came from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. And I've heard that Space New Zealand is an incredibly innovative example of an industry which you'd think of. Why would you come to New Zealand to fire rockets into space? Well, that innovative culture that created Space New Zealand is what's got to be harnessed here. So it's there. It's about connecting the components of governments, but also the stakeholders required to make it happen, I think. I'm optimistic.
Just quickly, I think, there is some urgency. I think that's reflecting your point, Peter, that, I actually have heard of, so Tony, I've just found out has left today, and I just saw you before, and another one of our genomic scientists who's heading to the Netherlands now. So I think if we don't move, we are losing capital, intellectual and technical capital. So there's another cost. So time to move, isn't it?
Anyone else got a question?
Kia ora koutou, ko Rinki Murphy. My name's Rinki Murphy. I'm an endocrinologist and researcher. I'd like to ask you a question, but I'd also like to share our experience of monogenic diabetes in New Zealand. In 2006, when I was doing my PhD in the UK, there were about 3 genes for neonatal diabetes. So anybody who was diagnosed with diabetes within the first 6 months of life were destined for life-term insulin treatment, sensors, pumps, the whole deal. Some of whom had epilepsy and musculoskeletal issues as well, all of which could be rescued by a very old medication called glibenclamide, very cheap and very easy to take. Now there's 80% of such cases under 12 months are able to be diagnosed with a monogenic condition. And there are a number of other monogenic diabetes cases. Our approach has been ad hoc, and when you make an ad hoc implementation of a genetic testing strategy, then it's inequitable by a number of reasons. The people who have connected with science and in the know will seek out my only clinic in Green Lane, and it's a virtual sort of centre for many years prior to Te Whatuora. But in terms of my question to you is, my approach thus far has been one patient, one whānau at a time, consenting them with an informed consent approach to say that these are the potential genetic etiologies. We can in-house test 4 of them. We can send them to a centre like the UK for 36 gene panels or more. We get gene variant curation, which is updated every 4 or 5 years, so we can get a new curation effort, and that has a consent by individual only. There isn't that same governance around going through the diagnostic genetics laboratory for any other issues like return of genetic information. There is a global effort of actually finding these neonatal genes, for example, and other monogenic diabetes genes, that if people didn't consent and contribute to that global effort, we wouldn't be here for monogenic diabetes with the advances that we've made. Many of them have been cost-saving, so I think that's one of the reasons why we're able to, as a small community of endocrinologists, able to get them funded for our patients, because it is cost-effective. It's not cost-effective, particularly cost-saving, when we do it in an ad hoc manner, because we don't find everyone with monogenic diabetes and change their treatment. But coming back to my question, do you think that's the right approach in terms of individual consent and whānau consent? And then the whole informed consent for cascade testing is really not done very well. We lose a lot of momentum because we run out of puff with genetic health counsellors, of which there aren't enough. It goes into a different pot of funding. You've got to go through genetics health. You can't come and see an endocrinologist. And my worry is that unless we have everybody under 30 who's diagnosed with diabetes go through a biomarker screening pathway and everybody gets it up and down the country, that this ad hoc approach will make inequities worse, but also potentially that layering of governance around whether or not informed consent by individuals and whānau is the right approach. Thanks.
Who'd like to?
Kia ora. Pai tō kōrero mai. It's a great narrative, my goodness, good challenge. And I would say individual consent's awesome and a start point. Whānau are around the individual to support them. A next thing to consider too is about posthumous use of data as well in our consent forms, the quality of our consent forms for informed consent, because they will hold the relationship, certainly as expressed by the originator of the data and their whānau, and inform us in institutions about their wishes, etc. So the ad hoc side of it's tough, and perhaps our institutions have a role there to do better in getting these narratives out there. These are also success stories that can be celebrated, particularly at those individual levels, and sharing those stories. They're triumphant, and they bring interest from, and word spreads. My own whānau's we've got a lot of stomach cancer in our family. But when we tell those stories, people listen and we relate to each other through that, through aroha and manaaki and those other traditions of being human. The relationship forms around our universal experience. So I'm being philosophical here because philosophy is a big part of this. And getting those, we aren't so good in New Zealand about talking philosophy and sharing our stories around health. And there's a lot of stories that are triumphant and we can be really proud of and find a lot of shared aroha in. So, tautoko tō mahi e oha.
I was just thinking quickly though that, we've got the Aotearoa model, which is, essentially for research, how we manage research, but just in the last couple of days thinking about what that model looks like for, as I mentioned earlier, clinical delivery. So that kind of connects with what Rinki's talking about. And, I think that's the next step actually, to explore how that's managed better rather than in an ad hoc way. That's all I've got to contribute to that, but maybe David has got some ideas.
We couldn't quite take it there in our study, but it's a natural next step.
Kia ora, Rinki. Hearing you talk, it just reminds me of me. We're battling away as champions of a technology that can change and improve clinical outcomes without a structure, without an infrastructure. And if you weren't there, that whole program would probably stop, right? The principles are the same in managing diabetes as they are in cancer, in that respect, is that we need structure, we need to be coordinated, centralised with really good consent and data management strategies that look after everyone who takes part. Yeah.
Tēnā koutou, ko Iupterechtu Kwanwa, he tangata tiriti aho. Tēnā koe hoti ana, Ben. Thank you for the kōrero. Something that we've also noticed over the last couple of years especially is that human diseases are not the only thing that threaten our health. infectious diseases, multi-drug resistant, and even hesitancy of people to go to a hospital for fear of infection. So I wanted to ask the panel, is there also an opportunity to look slightly more holistically at the health of the people that we're treating, to look at vaccine hesitancy, to look at their housing conditions, and how do we factor that into what we are discussing as precision health?
Yeah, ka tika koe. There's a lot of capacity for that. This is something mātauraka Māori can bring to science, because we have that mātauraka being holistic, can bring many lenses to an issue, a problem or a opportunity. And then the specialists bring their deep specialist knowledge as well when we're sitting beside each other. So I've got an economic development background, so I know the effects on well-being that not having your own home in your own landscape. A big factor for us is that we've been urbanised and we're away from our places. And so all of these have a bearing on well-being and health.
Can I just say that in Ngāti Pro we've set up what we call our Centre of Excellence. It's essentially where the research sits, and so there's quite a lot of other types of research, not just genomic research but also clinical research. We're moving into qualitative research, and of course part of the other hand or the other ringa to our Centre of Excellence is a population health approach. So that's the area where we're looking for, to develop community-led transformation and being able to address the social determinants by engaging with our communities. So that's how we've done it. Doesn't mean everyone else, all iwi settings, and in fact all settings across different countries in our country are different, they're diverse. And so they're not, our model may not be suitable for somewhere else, but that's what we're doing in order to address what you just said.
Kia ora, thank you for the questions from the floor, and I'd now like to invite the Chair of Medicines New Zealand, Todd Kriebel, to come up and close this evening. So,
distinguished guests, kia ora anō. As we reach the end of the evening, I'd like to extend my gratitude to each and every one of you for gracing us with your presence tonight. Tonight we've discussed the power of collaboration and collective impact that we can have when we work together. There's a wonderful opportunity here to improve equity of access and equity of outcomes when we start thinking about science and medicine as a service in its own right, as part of the total wider health service. This will take a lot of forward thinking and service design and delivery, especially as we see local communities taking more responsibility and pulling for services. And I think this can be guided, at least in part, by the new Code of Expectations for Health Entity Engagement with Consumers and Finance. Long title, but big shout out to HQSC for having put that out there as one of the early wins, which I think has been very below the radar in the Aotearoa legislation. And we got that now alongside the fact that the Minister spoke to us earlier about passage of the therapeutic products bill. So there you go, we got those two yin and yang things going right there. So in closing, I'd like to thank the Minister for her words earlier this evening, members of Parliament for gracing us and getting the bill through the House, our panellists, fantastic kōrero this evening, and a lot of passion. It's great to see. And thank you, Simon, for emceeing, and to all the staff working behind the scenes this evening. So, waho i te opoto, kaua i te roto. Let us keep close together, not far apart. Good evening to you all. Thank you.